In the spring of 1987, every cattle farmer in Tama County, Iowa, grazed the same way. They turned their herds out in April, let them roam from fence line to fence line, and pulled them back in October when the grass gave up. This was not a strategy. It was not a philosophy. It was not even a decision in any meaningful sense of the word. It was gravity. It was weather. It was the way the land worked and the way the people who worked the land had always understood it. Going back 3 generations to the homestead era when the first Iowans broke this ground with walking plows and mule teams and sheer stubbornness. The grass grew. The cattle ate it. The cycle repeated. Nobody asked whether there was a better way, because the current way had always been good enough. And in Tama County in 1987, good enough was the standard most men measured themselves against. Let me tell you about what good enough looked like in those years, because you need to understand the world Nora Tesdahl was walking into before you can understand what she did to it. A typical operation in Tama County in 1987 ran somewhere between 80 and 200 head of beef cattle on 300 to 600 acres of mixed pasture and cropland. The pastures were permanent, meaning they'd been fenced once, decades ago, and the same wire and the same corner posts had been doing the same job ever since. The cattle went in spring and came out in fall, and in between they ate what they wanted, where they wanted, when they wanted. Stocking rates were conservative by modern standards. Nobody was trying to maximize production per acre, because nobody had a framework for thinking about production per acre. You ran as many cattle as the land could hold without going bare, and you figured out how many that was by watching what happened when you ran too many, which every farmer in the county had done at least once, and most had done more than that. The grass in those pastures was a mixture of what the Extension Office called cool season species, mostly Kentucky bluegrass and smooth brome, with some orchard grass in the wetter spots and fescue along the fence lines where the cattle didn't graze as hard. It was not spectacular grass. It was not the deep-rooted native prairie that had once covered this part of Iowa before the plows came through. But it was persistent, and it was familiar, and it came back every spring without anyone doing much of anything to encourage it, which was exactly the kind of grass that Tama County farmers had come to rely on and, in their quieter moments, to love. The Tesdahl operation sat on 480 acres in the northeast corner of the county, about 6 miles from the town of Toledo. Nora's father, Harlan Tesdahl, had farmed it since 1961, the year he married her mother, Ruth, and took over from his own father, who had run the same land since 1934. Harlan was a careful man, methodical. He kept records in a green ledger book that he stored on the top shelf of the mudroom, and every fall he would sit at the kitchen table and go through the numbers with the same deliberate patience he applied to everything else. He ran 140 head on 280 acres of pasture and cropped the remaining 200 acres in corn and soybeans on a 2-year rotation. His pastures averaged about 180 pounds of beef per acre per year, which was consistent with county averages and which Harlan considered acceptable. Not remarkable, acceptable. He had never seen a reason to expect more than acceptable from a pasture, and nobody in Tama County had ever suggested he should. Let me tell you about Nora Tesdahl, because she is the reason this story exists, and she is different from almost every character this channel has ever told you about. Nora was 22 years old in the spring of 1989. She had just come home from Iowa State University in Ames with a degree in agronomy and a head full of ideas that her father regarded with the cautious skepticism of a man who had been farming successfully for 28 years without the benefit of a university education. She was not loud about her ideas. She was not the kind of person who walked into a room and announced herself. She was quiet in the way that people are quiet when they are paying very close attention to everything around them, and she had been paying very close attention to the pastures on the Tesdall farm since she was old enough to walk them. She had noticed things. She had written things down. She had a notebook, a yellow legal pad that she had started filling in her junior year of college, covered in her small, precise handwriting, full of numbers and diagrams and citations from research papers that most farmers in Tama County had never heard of and would not have read if they had. The thing Nora had been reading about and thinking about and drawing diagrams of in her yellow notebook was called rotational grazing. More specifically, it was a system that a Zimbabwean farmer and ecologist named Alan Savory had been developing since the 1960s, which Savory called holistic planned grazing, and which a growing number of researchers at land-grant universities were beginning to study with serious interest. The basic idea was not complicated, though its implications were profound. Instead of letting cattle graze an entire pasture continuously from spring to fall, you divided the pasture into a series of small paddocks, Savory called them cells, and you moved the herd through those paddocks on a rotating schedule, giving each paddock a long rest period between grazing events. The cattle would graze each paddock intensively for a short time, then move on, and the paddock would be left alone for 60 to 90 days, sometimes longer, to recover fully before being grazed again. Let me tell you about the science, because the science is the reason this story ends the way it does. The principle behind rotational grazing is rooted in the ecological history of the North American grasslands, and to understand it, you need to think about what those grasslands looked like before the homesteaders arrived. The native prairies of Iowa and Kansas and Nebraska had evolved over thousands of years in the presence of enormous herds of bison. Estimates run as high as 60 million animals at peak population that moved across the landscape in dense, tightly packed groups driven by predators and instinct. Those herds would descend on a section of prairie, graze it intensively for a few days or weeks, and then move on, not returning to the same ground for months or even years. The grass had evolved to handle this pattern. It had evolved, in fact, to thrive under it. Intensive defoliation followed by extended rest stimulated root growth, increased organic matter in the soil, improved water infiltration, and encouraged the deep-rooted perennial species that built the rich black topsoil that made Iowa farmland the most productive in the world. What continuous grazing does, what every farmer in Tama County was doing in 1987, is the opposite. Cattle are selective grazers. They return to the same plants over and over, grazing the most palatable species before those plants can recover, while leaving less desirable species alone. Over years and decades, continuous grazing shifts the plant community away from productive, deep-rooted perennials and toward shallow-rooted, less palatable species that cattle avoid. The grass looks fine. It comes back every spring. But it is producing a fraction of what it could produce under a managed system, and its root system is a fraction of what it should be, and its ability to hold water and resist drought is a fraction of what the original prairie had. The farmers of Tama County were not doing anything wrong by the standards they had inherited. They were just doing something that had been quietly costing them money for 3 generations, and nobody had given them a reason to look at it differently. Nora's yellow notebook had the numbers. Research from the University of Missouri showed that well-managed rotational grazing systems could increase carrying capacity, the number of cattle a given acreage could support, by 30 to 50% over continuous grazing systems on comparable land. Research from Kansas State showed improvements in forage quality, with crude protein levels running 18 to 22% higher in rotationally grazed paddocks than in continuously grazed pastures. A long-term study out of the Rodale Institute documented soil organic matter increases of 1.2 to 1.8 percentage points over a 10-year period under intensive rotational management. Numbers that translated directly into improved drought resistance, improved water retention, and improved long-term productivity. And a farmer in Missouri named Greg Judy, whose operation Nora had read about in a Stockman Grass Farmer article, had documented carrying capacity improvements of over 60% on his own land after converting from continuous to rotational grazing over a 5-year period. Nora had done the math for the Tesdall farm. If she could achieve even a 30% improvement in carrying capacity on the 280 acres of pasture her father was currently running, that meant 42 additional animal units, roughly $25,000 in additional beef production at 1989 prices, from the same ground, with no additional feed costs, no additional land, and no additional equipment beyond the fencing required to create the paddock system. The fencing would cost money. She had priced it out. Temporary electric fencing, poly wire on step-in posts, could be installed and moved at a fraction of the cost of permanent woven wire, and a basic 12-paddock system covering the home pastures could be set up for under $3,000 in materials. The return on that investment, if the research held on Tesdall ground, would be recovered in the first year. She brought this to the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening in March of 1989. Harlan Tesdall listened to his daughter for 25 minutes without interrupting. He looked at the yellow notebook. He looked at the numbers she had written in columns on a piece of graph paper. He looked at the diagram she had drawn of the home pasture divided into 12 paddocks with a central water point and a lane system for moving cattle. He set his fork down about halfway through and didn't pick it up again. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet for a long moment. Ruth Tesdall, who had been listening from the sink where she was washing the supper dishes, turned around and dried her hands on a dish towel and said, quietly and without drama, "She's right, you know." Harlan looked at his wife. He looked at his daughter. He looked back at the graph paper. "I need to think about it," he said. He thought about it for 2 weeks. What he said at the end of those 2 weeks was this: "You can have the south pasture, 80 acres. Run your system on it for 1 season. We'll see what the numbers say." He paused. "Don't touch the home pasture until we know something." Nora said that was fine. Now, let me tell you about the man who made sure that as many people as possible knew about Harlan Tesdall's daughter and her small paddocks, because no story like this one is complete without someone who sees an unfamiliar idea and decides that laughter is the appropriate response. His name was Dale Crowley. He was 58 years old in 1989, and he had been the primary sales representative for Crowley Farm Supply in Toledo for 31 years, having inherited the business from his father, who had opened it in 1941. Dale Crowley was not a stupid man. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had spent 3 decades building relationships with every farmer in Tama County, who knew their operations and their families and their finances with an intimacy that bordered on the professional, and who had accumulated, through those 3 decades of daily contact with the land and the people who worked it, an absolute certainty that he understood how farming in Tama County worked. He held court at the co-op counter most mornings from 7 to 9, drinking coffee from a styrofoam cup and talking about prices and weather and equipment with whoever came through the door, and his opinions on farming practice carried the weight that comes from longevity and familiarity and the simple social authority of a man who has been in the same room saying the same kinds of things for a very long time. Nora made the mistake, if it was a mistake, and in the long run it probably wasn't, of stopping at Crowley Farm Supply in early April of 1989 to price out the polywire and step-in posts she needed for the Paddocks system. She was not trying to announce herself. She was buying supplies. But Dale Crowley asked her what she was building, and she told him, and the silence that followed her explanation lasted about 3 seconds before Dale Crowley started laughing. It was not a mean laugh. That was almost the worst thing about it. It was the laugh of a man who has just heard something so self-evidently mistaken that he cannot help but find it charming. "Honey," he said, and the word landed the way it always does when a man uses it to address a woman who has just said something he considers naive. "Your daddy's been grazing that south pasture for 30 years, and it's never given him a lick of trouble. You're going to put up a bunch of little electric fences and move those cows around like a chess game, and you think that's going to make the grass grow better?" He shook his head. "Those cows need room to move. You crowd them into a little paddock and you're going to have bare ground and compaction and a vet bill before August." He looked at the man standing next to him at the counter, a farmer named Wes Sievert, who ran 180 head about 4 miles south. And Wes Sievert smiled the smile of a man who is not entirely sure what's funny, but is willing to take the cue from someone who seems to be. Nora looked at Dale Crowley for a moment. She was not angry, or if she was, it didn't show. The research from Missouri and Kansas State both show carrying capacity improvements of 30 to 50% under rotational management, she said. The compaction concern is addressed by limiting grazing time per paddock to 3 to 5 days. The root recovery data is pretty clear. She paused. "I've got the papers in the truck if you want to look at them." Dale Crowley smiled. "I've been selling supplies to every farmer in this county for 30 years, he said. "I think I know a little something about how grass grows." "I'll take the polywire and the posts," Nora said. She loaded her truck and drove home. "Now, let me pause here and ask you something, because I think it's worth sitting with what just happened in that supply store for a moment before we go any further." Dale Crowley had 30 years of experience. He was not wrong that he knew the farmers of Tama County and their land. He was not wrong that he had seen a lot of ideas come through that door and fail. What he was wrong about, what he could not see from behind that counter, was that his 30 years of experience were 30 years of watching the same system operate under the same assumptions. He had never seen a well-managed rotational system on Iowa ground because nobody in Tama County had ever run one. His certainty was not built on evidence. It was built on the absence of a counterexample, and the absence of a counterexample is not the same thing as proof. Nora Tesdall knew that. Dale Crowley did not. Let me tell you about the spring and summer of 1989, because that first season on the South Pasture is where the story begins to turn. Nora installed the paddock system in the first 2 weeks of April. She divided the 80-acre South Pasture into 12 paddocks of roughly 6 to 7 acres each, using polywire strung on step-in posts at intervals of about 100 feet. She ran a single strand at 30 inches and a second strand at 18 inches to keep calves from ducking under. She installed a central water line with a float-controlled tank that she could move between paddocks, and she cut a 12-foot lane along the east fence line that she could use to move cattle from paddock to paddock without driving them across grazed ground. The whole installation took her 11 days working mostly alone, with her father helping on weekends when he wasn't occupied with the corn planting. She stocked the paddocks with 35 head, cow-calf pairs, mostly, drawn from the main herd, which was roughly the same stocking rate her father ran on comparable acreage in his continuous system. The rotation schedule she set up called for 3 to 4 days of grazing per paddock, followed by a rest period of 40 to 45 days before the cattle returned. In practice, she watched the grass rather than the calendar, moving the herd when the forage in the current paddock had been grazed down to about 4 inches of residual height, and not returning to a rested paddock until the grass had regrown to 8 to 10 inches. She kept records. Every entry in the yellow notebook got a date, a paddock number, a residual height measurement, and a note on cattle condition and behavior. She weighed the calves every 30 days on a portable scale she borrowed from her father's vet. The first thing she noticed, within 3 weeks of starting the rotation, was that the cattle were calmer than she expected. The conventional wisdom, Dale Crowley's wisdom, held that crowding cattle into small paddocks would stress them. What she observed was the opposite. The cattle in the paddocks were grazing steadily and evenly, moving through the available forage in an orderly pattern, and settling into a routine that made them easy to handle. When she opened the gate to move them to the next paddock, they walked through without any drama, as if they understood the system and had decided to cooperate with it. She wrote this down. The second thing she noticed, about 6 weeks in, was the grass in the rested paddocks. The first paddock she had grazed in April was, by mid-June, carrying a stand of grass that was visibly taller, denser, and darker green than anything in the continuously grazed home pasture. She walked it with a ruler. The average sward height was 11 inches. In the home pasture, at the same date, the average height was 4 inches, with bare patches near the water tank and along the cattle trails. She photographed both. She wrote the measurements down. She did not say anything to her father yet. She wanted more data. By mid-August, she had enough data to see what was happening clearly. The paddocks that had gone through 2 full rotations were showing a measurable shift in species composition. Less smooth brome, more orchard grass and native species she recognized from her plant identification coursework, including some big bluestem and Indian grass that she had not expected to see, emerge from what she had assumed was a degraded seed bank. The soil in those paddocks, when she pushed a soil probe into it, went down 14 inches before hitting significant resistance. In the home pasture, the probe hit resistance at 7 inches. She was seeing, in a single season, the beginning of the root depth recovery that the Missouri research had documented over 5 years. It was happening faster than she had expected, which she later learned was not unusual on ground that had been continuously grazed for decades. The suppressed species were still there, waiting in the seed bank, needing only the combination of rest and intensive defoliation that the rotation provided to reassert themselves. In October, when she pulled the cattle off the south pasture and weighed the calves for the final time, the numbers were unambiguous. The 35 cow-calf pairs on the 80-acre rotational system had produced 210 pounds of weaned calf weight per acre. Harlan Tesdall's 140 head on 280 acres of continuous pasture had produced 178 pounds per acre. Nora's paddocks had outproduced the continuous system by 18% in the first year, on ground that her father considered the less productive half of the farm's pasture acreage. The calves from the rotational paddocks weaned at an average of 542 pounds. The calves from the continuous pasture weaned at 498 pounds. She had spent $2,840 on fencing materials. At 1989, calf prices of approximately 78 cents per pound. The additional production from the rotational system represented roughly $4,700 in additional revenue above what the same acreage had produced the year before. She put all of this on graph paper and brought it to the kitchen table in November. Harlan Tesdall looked at the numbers for a long time. He looked at the photograph she had taken of the paddocks in August, with the dense, tall grass, and the photograph she had taken of the home pasture at the same date, with the short, thin stand and the bare patches. He picked up the graph paper and held it closer to the kitchen light. Ruth Tesdall sat down at the table, which she had not done during the first presentation. Harlan set the paper down. He was quiet for what felt like a long time. Then he said, "You were right." 3 words. He did not elaborate. He did not apologize for the skepticism or for the 2-week pause before he gave her the south pasture. He just said she was right, in the same quiet tone he used for everything, and then he picked up his fork and finished his supper. But Nora noticed that after supper, instead of going to watch the news in the living room the way he usually did, he stayed at the kitchen table and asked her to walk him through the rotation schedule again, step by step. They sat there until 10 o'clock. When she finally went to bed, she heard him in the mudroom, taking the green ledger book down from the shelf. He gave her the home pasture in the spring of 1990. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because the south pasture was the proof of concept. But the home pasture is where the story became something larger. The home pasture was 200 acres, divided by Nora into 18 paddocks of varying size to account for the terrain. There was a wet corner near the north fence that she set aside as a sacrifice area for the shoulder seasons, and a ridge section along the east edge that she grazed last in each rotation to take advantage of the later growth flush on the higher ground. She increased the herd on the home pasture from 140 head to 160 head in the first year of rotation, a 14% increase in stocking rate, and told her father they would add more if the forage held. The forage held. By midsummer of 1990, the home pasture was carrying 160 head on 200 acres with better body condition scores across the herd than Harlan had ever recorded in his green ledger book. The grass was, by every visible measure, healthier than it had been in decades. The bare patches near the old water tank had closed over. The soil probe was going down 12 inches in paddocks that had been through 2 rotations. In 1990, the combined pasture system, south pasture and home pasture, 280 acres total, produced 228 pounds of weaned calf weight per acre, an improvement of 28% over the 1988 baseline. Revenue from the calf crop was up $31,000 over 1988 on essentially the same infrastructure. Harlan looked at those numbers in November and said, "You decide the rotation next year." He meant it as a statement of trust, and Nora understood it that way. The people driving past on the county road understood it differently. They understood it as a curiosity. Farmers who had been driving that road for 30 years had never seen a pasture divided into a grid of small paddocks with cattle bunched tightly together in one section, while the rest of the ground stood empty and growing. It looked wrong to them. It looked like something a person would do if they didn't understand how cattle grazing worked, which was, in the assessment of the men who gathered at Crowley Farm Supply most mornings, exactly what it was. Dale Crowley had a theory about why the numbers Nora was reporting were misleading. Something about how the calves were being weighed, or how the acreage was being calculated, or how the comparison wasn't fair because the home pasture had always been better ground than the south pasture. And this theory circulated through the co-op counter conversations with the persistence of a rumor that nobody could quite verify but nobody wanted to let go of. Because letting go of it meant considering the possibility that a 22-year-old woman with a notebook had seen something that 30 years of accumulated experience had missed. The drought came in 1991. Let me tell you about the summer of 1991, because that summer is the reason this story is still being told, and because it is the moment when the argument that had been running quietly through Tama County for 2 years finally got an answer that nobody could dispute. The drought of 1991 was not the worst drought in Iowa history, but it was severe enough to matter. Rainfall in Tama County from June through August of 1991 ran about 40% below the 30-year average. The corn crop took a significant hit. Yield estimates across the county ran 20 to 25% below normal, and some of the sandier ground in the southern part of the county came in worse than that. But the pastures were where the drought hit hardest, because pasture grass has no irrigation and no replanting option, and no crop insurance that pays out at a meaningful rate. And when the rain stops in June and doesn't come back until September, the grass simply stops growing, and the cattle that depend on it either lose weight or get sold or get fed expensive hay that a farmer had not planned to buy. By the first week of July, the continuously grazed pastures in Tama County looked the way continuously grazed pastures always look in a drought year. Short, thin, brown at the tips, with the bare patches near water tanks and gates expanding outward as the cattle concentrated their grazing pressure on whatever green remained. Wes Sievert, who ran 180 head on 380 acres south of Toledo, sold 60 head in July because his pastures couldn't carry them. He sold them at the worst possible time, into a market that was already soft because half the county was doing the same thing, and he got 64 cents per pound for calves that should have brought 78 cents. The losses across the county from forced early sales and emergency hay purchases ran into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Nora Tesdall's paddocks looked different. They did not look lush. This was not a miracle of water creation. The drought was real, and the Tesdall pastures felt it. But the paddocks that had been under rotational management for 2 full years had root systems that went down 14 to 16 inches, and those roots were reaching moisture that the shallow-rooted, continuously grazed pastures could not access. The rest periods in the rotation meant that at any given moment, 2/3 of the paddocks were in recovery with no grazing pressure, allowing the grass to maintain photosynthetic capacity and continue drawing moisture from depth. The soil organic matter in the rotationally managed paddocks, she had sent samples to the ISU Extension Lab in the fall of 1990, was running 4.1% compared to 2.8% in the home pasture before conversion and 2.6% in Wes Sievert's comparable pasture. Higher organic matter meant higher water-holding capacity, which in a drought year meant the difference between grass that kept growing slowly and grass that stopped growing entirely. She did not sell a single animal in the summer of 1991. She did extend her rest periods. Instead of 45-day rotations, she moved to 60-day rotations in July and August, reducing the grazing pressure on each paddock and giving the grass more time to recover between events. She reduced her stocking rate temporarily by moving 20 head to a dry lot and supplementing with hay. But the hay she fed was hay she had cut from the paddocks earlier in the season, in May and early June, when the rotational system had produced more forage than the herd could graze, and she had taken the surplus as hay rather than letting it go to waste. She had 40 round bales stored under a tarp behind the barn. She had planned for this, not because she had known the drought was coming, but because the rotation system had given her surplus forage in the good months that she could bank against the bad ones. In October of 1991, when the County Extension Office published its annual pasture productivity summary, the numbers told the story plainly. The average weaned calf weight per acre across Tama County's conventional continuous grazing operations had dropped to 134 pounds, down from a 5-year average of 171 pounds, a reduction of 22% from the drought impact. Nora Tesdall's rotational system had produced 198 pounds of weaned calf weight per acre in the same drought year. Her per-acre productivity in the worst year of the decade was higher than the county average in a normal year. The revenue comparison was starker. The average Tama County cow-calf producer running 150 head had lost approximately $18,000 to $22,000 in 1991, relative to a normal year, between forced sales, depressed prices, and emergency hay purchases. Nora's operation had finished the year $6,200 above her 1990 revenue, because the hay surplus she had accumulated allowed her to maintain her herd through the drought without selling into a soft market, and because the cattle she sold in October sold at October prices rather than July prices. She did not go to the co-op and announce any of this. She did not write a letter to the Toledo Chronicle. She went to the extension office in November and sat down with the county extension agent, a man named Paul Briggs, who had been watching the Tesdall operation with quiet interest since 1989, and she went through her data with him, paddock by paddock, season by season, and she answered his questions for 2 hours, and when she left him with a copy of her yellow notebook's data pages and a list of the research citations she had been working from. Paul Briggs published a summary of the Tesdall operations results in the County Extension newsletter in January of 1992. It ran 3 pages. It included the per-acre productivity comparisons, the soil organic matter data, the drought year revenue figures, and a description of the paddock system with a diagram that looked a great deal like the diagram Nora had first drawn on graph paper at the kitchen table in March of 1989. Let me tell you about the morning in February of 1992 when Dale Crowley drove out to the Tesdall farm, because that morning is where the accountant gets settled. He came on a Tuesday in his pickup, arriving at the farm around 9 in the morning. Nora was in the barn working on the water line for the paddock system, replacing a section of polypipe that had cracked in the January freeze. She heard the truck in the yard and came out to find Dale Crowley, standing by his door with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the south pasture, which was dormant and brown under a thin crust of snow, but which even in February showed the paddock divisions clearly. The step-in posts still in place, the poly wire catching the winter light. He was not the same man who had laughed at the supply counter in April of 1989. He was still Dale Crowley. He still had the same face and the same coat and the same way of standing with his weight on his back foot. But something in the set of his shoulders had changed. He looked, Nora thought, like a man who had been carrying something heavy for a while and had finally decided to set it down. "I read Briggs's piece in the newsletter," he said. Nora waited. "Those numbers are real," he said. "The drought year numbers?" "They're from my records," she said. "Paul Briggs verified them against the extension office data." Dale Crowley nodded slowly. He looked at the south pasture again. He looked at the step-in posts. "I told you those cows needed room to move," he said. "I told you you'd have compaction and bare ground and a vet bill before August." He said it quietly, without the laugh that had been in his voice in 1989. He said it like a man reading from a document he wished he hadn't signed. "You did," Nora said. "Doesn't look like that's what happened." "No," she said. "It isn't." He was quiet for a moment. A cold wind came across the south pasture and moved the poly wire on the nearest post. "I've got 4 farmers asking me about this system," he said. "After Briggs's piece, they want to know how to set it up." He paused. "I don't know how to answer them." Nora looked at him for a moment. "The lesson isn't that my paddocks are magic," she said. "The lesson is that any farm that grows grass the same way every year, on every acre, with no rest and no recovery, is a farm that's spending down its soil capital without knowing it. The drought didn't ruin those pastures. The drought just showed what was already missing." She paused. "The rest periods give the grass back what continuous grazing takes away. That's the whole thing. That's all it is." Dale Crowley looked at her. He nodded once, slowly, the nod of a man who is accepting something he cannot argue with. "Could you talk to those 4 farmers?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I can do that." Let me tell you about the years that followed that February morning, because the conversation in the Tesdell farmyard was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a different one. By the spring of 1992, Nora was running a paddock system on all 280 acres of Tesdell pasture and carrying 195 head, a 39% increase over the 140 head her father had run in 1988 on the same acreage, with better body condition scores, lower vet costs, and a per-acre forage yield that Paul Briggs calculated at 31% above the county average. The soil organic matter across the home pasture had climbed from 2.8% in 1989 to 3.6% in 1992, a gain of 0.8 percentage points in 3 years that would have taken 15 to 20 years to achieve without the rotational management. The root depth in the most intensively managed paddocks was now running 18 inches, more than double the 7-inch depth she had measured in the home pasture before conversion. The 4 farmers who had asked Dale Crowley about the system after Briggs's newsletter piece came out to the Tesdell farm in March of 1992. Nora walked them through the paddock layout, explained the rotation schedule, showed them the soil probe data, and answered their questions for most of an afternoon. All 4 of them installed rotational systems that spring. By the fall of 1992, all 4 reported improvements in forage yield and cattle condition that were consistent with what the Tesdell data had shown. Word spread the way word spreads in a small county. Through the co-op, through the elevator, through the conversations at the Farm Bureau meetings that Nora had started attending and where she had begun to speak, quietly and with data, about what she was seeing on the ground. By 1994, 22 farms in Tama County were running some form of rotational grazing system. By 1996, that number was 41. Paul Briggs presented the county-wide data at the Iowa Cattlemen's Association annual meeting in Des Moines in 1995, and the presentation drew more questions than any other session on the program. He gave Nora Tesdell's name as the source of the original work. She was in the audience. She was 28 years old. She was wearing a Carhartt jacket and a seed cap, and she had grease on her left hand from a waterline repair she had finished that morning before driving to Des Moines. When Paul Briggs said her name, the people in her row turned to look at her, and someone near the front started clapping, and the room followed. Harlan Tesdell was in the audience too. He was sitting 3 seats to her left. When the room started clapping, he stood up. He did not look at Nora. He looked at the front of the room, at the data on Paul Briggs's slide, and he stood up straight, the way a man stands when he is proud of something and does not know how else to show it. Let me tell you about the last thing, because the story has one more turn in it, and it happens at the Tesdell kitchen table in the spring of 1997. Nora was 30 years old. She had been running the Tesdell operation for 5 years by then, with Harlan stepping back gradually into an advisory role that suited him better than the daily physical work, which his knees had been protesting since 1993. The farm was producing at levels that would have seemed implausible to anyone who had known it in 1988. 210 had on 280 acres of pasture, a per-acre revenue figure that was running 44% above the 1988 baseline in real terms, soil organic matter trending upward every year, and a reputation that had brought visitors from as far as Wisconsin and Missouri to walk the paddocks and ask questions. At supper one evening in April, Nora's daughter, she had married in 1993, a quiet man named Owen Holloway, who had grown up on a farm 2 counties over and who had the good sense to understand what he had married into. Nora's daughter, who was 3 years old and whose name was June, was not at the table that evening. But Nora's younger brother, Thomas, who was 24 and had been working the crop acres for 2 years, was. And Thomas said, over supper, that he had been reading about cover crops, specifically about using a multi-species cover crop mix: radishes, turnips, cereal rye, crimson clover, in the corn and soybean rotation, to build soil health in the cropped acres the way the rotational grazing had built the soil health in the pastures. He had a stack of articles from the Practical Farmer magazine and a printout from an ISU extension publication. He slid them across the table toward Nora. Nora looked at the articles. She looked at her brother. She thought about a kitchen table in March of 1989 and a yellow notebook and a father who had said he needed to think about it and then thought about it for 2 weeks before giving her 80 acres and a chance. She thought about the south pasture in August of 1989 with the grass at 11 inches and the soil probe going down 14 inches, and the way that had felt like a confirmation of something she had known but had not yet been able to prove. She looked at the articles for a long time. Then she looked up at her brother. "Yes," she said, "let's try it." She did not ask for 2 weeks to think about it. Harlan Tesdall was at the table. He heard the exchange. He picked up one of Thomas's articles and read the first page. He set it down. He said nothing, but Nora saw him, later that evening, take the green ledger book down from the shelf in the mudroom and carry it to the kitchen table, and sit down with it and open it to a fresh page. Some things you learn the hard way, and some things you learn by watching someone else learn the hard way, and being smart enough to recognize what you're seeing. Harlan Tesdall had learned it the hard way, in the slow way, over 2 seasons of watching his daughter's paddocks outperform everything he had built over 28 years of careful, methodical, acceptable farming. He had learned it well enough that when his son slid a stack of articles across the table, he did not say he needed to think about it. He reached for the ledger book. The south pasture in Tama County still runs on a 12-paddock rotation. The home pasture still runs on 18. The soil organic matter in the oldest paddocks is now above 5%, which the ISU Extension Lab calls exceptional for this part of Iowa. Nora Tesdall Holloway still walks the paddocks with a soil probe and a notebook, not the yellow legal pad, which filled up in 1993, but a series of green notebooks that she has kept since then, 1 per year, stored on the same shelf in the mudroom where her father used to keep the green ledger book. The 2 series of notebooks sit side by side now, his handwriting and hers. The same shelf, different conclusions about what the land could do. Dale Crowley retired in 2001. At his retirement party at the Toledo Fire Hall, he gave a short speech in which he said that the thing he was most proud of in 31 years of business was that he had been wrong about something important early enough to learn from it. He did not name Nora Tesdall. He did not need to. Everyone in the room knew who he was talking about. She planted sunflowers in a wheat county. She fenced cattle into small paddocks in an open-range county. They laughed. The drought came. The open pastures went brown and bare, and the forced sales went through at 64 cents a pound. The paddocks kept growing, the notebooks kept filling, and the lesson that a 22-year-old woman with a yellow legal pad wrote out in a Tama County kitchen in March of 1989 is still being taught, one paddock at a time, on ground that finally got the rest it needed.